Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW's Fall Brawl 1998. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It is a tag team matchup. It is Disco Inferno teaming up with Alex Wright versus Jim the Anvil Neidhart and British Bulldog. I thought it was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams, with Neidhart and Bulldog keeping the pace of the match, with Bulldog ultimately hitting his signature power slam on Disco Inferno. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Jim the Anvil Neidhart and the British Bulldog. Hats off to Jim the Anvil Neidhart and the British Bulldog for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Fake Goldberg versus Chris Jericho. I thought this was an okay matchup. Jericho was keeping the pace throughout the entire match. Fake Goldberg then ultimately hits a spear on Jericho, but Jericho applies a Walls of Jericho on Fake Goldberg. And your winner of the match is Chris Jericho. Hats off to Chris Jericho for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Ernest Miller versus Norman Smiley. I thought this was an okay matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Miller and Smiley, with Smiley keeping the pace of the match. Ernest Miller, though, ultimately hits the finish on Norman Smiley. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match, or winner of the match, I should say, is Ernest Miller. Hats off to Ernest Miller for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Rick Steiner versus Scott Steiner. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Rick Steiner and Scott Steiner, with Rick Steiner keeping the pace of the match. Rick Steiner then attacks Buff Bagwell. EMTs come out to take Bagwell to the back. Match ultimately ends in a no contest. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is for the WCW Cruiserweight Championship. It is Juventud Guerrera versus Silver King. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Guerrera and Silver King, with Guerrera keeping the pace of the match. Guerrera then hits a head scissors takeover on Silver King. Guerrera then hits a springboard hurricanrana on Silver King as well. Silver King then hits a super kick on Guerrera in the middle of the ring. Guerrera then gets up, hits a poison rana off the top rope on Silver King. And then Guerrera ultimately hits his signature 450 splash on the top rope on Silver King. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Juventud Guerrera. Hats off to Juventud Guerrera for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a Ravens Rules match. It is Raven versus Saturn. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Raven and Saturn, with Raven keeping the pace of the match. Saturn then hits a Death Valley driver off the apron on Lodi through a table on the outside. It looked absolutely brutal. Raven then hits a DDT on Saturn for a near fall, but Saturn gets up, hits a Death Valley driver on Raven in the middle of the ring. Pins for the 3. And your winner of the match is Saturn. Hats off to Saturn for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Dean Malenko versus Curt Hennig. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Malenko and Hennig, with Malenko keeping the pace of the match. Malenko then hits a fisherman suplex on Hennig. Rick Rude is ringside. Rick Rude then gets involved in this match by attacking Malenko, which allows Dean Malenko to win this match by disqualification. Hats off to Dean Malenko for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Conan versus Scott Hall. I thought this was a good match. Back and forth matchup between Conan and Hall, with Conan keeping the pace of the match. And Conan ultimately applies his signature Tequila Sunrise on Scott Hall. And your winner of the match is Conan. Hats off to Conan for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of WCW's Fall Brawl 1998. It is the War Games matchup. It is Team WCW versus Team NWO versus Team NWO Wolfpack. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup. DDP and Hart were both started the War Games matchup. But DDP ultimately hits a Diamond Cutter on Stevie Ray. Pins for the 3. And your winners of the match are Team WCW. Hats off to Team WCW for getting the win in this matchup. Couple of things I'm going to say about Fall Brawl 1998 before I get out of here, man. Number one, it was an okay event. I'm not going to sit here and say that Fall Brawl was the best event that WCW put together for 1998. Not by a long shot. I think there was a couple matches on here I could have done without. Number one, Fake Goldberg versus Chris Jericho. Was it hilarious? Yeah, it was hilarious to see Fake Goldberg come out. But I think this was a part where, in Jericho's career, in WCW, where I feel like Jericho, they really didn't have much for Jericho. I mean, Jericho was holding the television championship, which is correct, but I feel like they really weren't booking people up against Jericho for that television championship, in my honest opinion, towards Jericho's run, end of his run in WCW. Ernest Miller and Norman Smiley, again, I could have done without that match. It was great to see Rick Steiner versus Scott Steiner to finish up that storyline between the Steiner brothers. Juventud Guerrero versus Silver King. It was a solid match. The one thing that I would take away from that match was, A, the fact that it was for the Cruiserweight Championship that Guerrero was holding, and two, Silver King. Silver King's an absolute legend, but the biggest thing I took away from that this was a cruiserweight matchup, and I think Silver King was walking around at the time at like 240, close to 250, so I don't know how, Eric Bischoff swung that, but, whatever, it made for a great match, and again, hats off to Guerrero for getting the win in that matchup. Dean Malenko versus Curt Hennig, solid matchup. The storyline around this matchup was that Dean Malenko and Arn Anderson, they were trying to reform the Four Horsemen with the helps of Arn Anderson, so it was great to see that storyline. Obviously, the Four Horsemen are a dominant force to be reckoned with within pro wrestling. One of the all-time greatest stables in professional wrestling, so it was great to see Dean Malenko in a match. It was also great to see Arn Anderson involved in this matchup as well, due to the fact that Rude attacked Malenko in this matchup to allow Malenko to get the win by disqualification. Then the War Games matchup. I mean, Fall Brawl 1998, for me, it all came down to the main event. It was Team WCW versus Team NWO versus Team NWO Wolfpack. It was all about the main event, with DDP hitting that diamond cutter on Stevie Ray to pick up the victory for Team WCW. With that being said, though, just like I do with every single one of these pay-per-views, you guys know by now, I always give these pay-per-views a rating from 1 out of 10. 1 being the absolute worst, 10 being the absolute best. I'm going to have to give WCW Fall Brawl 1998 a solid rating of a 4.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW's Fall Brawl 1998. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.